Real leaders must be ready to sacrifice for all their for the freedom of their people. Leadership is very important, and it is only those people that share Joseph generational, brand that are willing to sacrifice everything for the freedom of their people. This is Marketplace Media, an online platform that engages, equips, and encourages believers to say inawezekana. If this is your first time being here, we encourage you to subscribe so that every time when you upload a new video, we shall subscribe. We've been discussing Joseph generation type of leaders, and the big question is, do we have examples in Africa? Africa has attracted bad taglines. Some people think that Africa is a continent of dark people, is a continent of undeveloped people, and we receive all kind of negative publicity. Is a dark continent, is a continent of savages, barbaric people. Now, no wonder they write and say that if you want to hide anything from an African, then put it in books, because Africans don't read. And that this is the media discussion that we'll put in this today's topic on Joseph generation leaders is to scout, is to walk through Africa and identify whether there are those people that would call Joseph generation leaders. Of course, from our previous broadcast, we shared some of the traits, some of the characteristics that actually distinguish this type of leaders that we call Joseph generation. And in our previous episodes, if you remember, and by the way, you can always visit them on our YouTube channel, you will see why we are motivated to talk about Joseph generational leaders. Because where we stand, especially as Marketplace Media, we believe that the solution towards corruption, the solution towards tribalism, the solution towards poverty, and endless anarchy and bloodshed and military coups that are always on rise, especially in this continent of Africa, actually lies in us birthing and raising Joseph generation leaders. And until up to and including that time when church, because we believe that the church and also the education sector and the media have the responsibility, indispensable responsibility, to be able to raise this type of leaders, then we shall continue living in anarchy and living in a moment where we would not always be very happy. Going to America, we have what we call George Bush, who passed on in 2018, and this guy is celebrated as somebody who talked about be strong, do your best, try hard, forgive, stay on course. And in his 1989 inaugural speech, he said these important words. He said, "For we are given power." Now get this. "For we are given power not to advance our own purposes, nor to make a great show in the world, nor a name." Okay? "There is but one just use of power, and it is to serve people." Look at that. Impressive. The goal that we need power for, is not to make ourselves great, is not to push our selfish ends. No. The reason why we need power is so that we may serve people. It's just like Christ said in Mark 10. Because he said in Mark 10 verse 45 that I came to be a ransom for many. In other words, Christ is saying, I came to save people. Now, one of the examples that we can pick very quickly is none other but the guy that we call Nelson Mandela. This is the guy that I would want to believe that is a, I think that's the guy that comes to mind. And let's talk about Nelson Mandela, because I believe he is a very important person who actually can teach us something about leadership today. Now, on 1918, in the last century, the world gave birth to Nelson Lohahila Mandela. He was raised in a royal home, and even at early age he was called Madiba. And he was born in a polygamous family, and at an early age he actually lost his father, barely 9 years. His father passed on thanks to lung cancer. But he was blessed because his mother was a Christian, and so he raised him even at that early age. And he was enrolled in a Methodist school, and later he joined University of Fort Hare in 1938. And he was not able to complete his studies because he organized a student strike, and he moved to Johannesburg, where he worked as a policeman. But then his appetite for education would not stop him. Even as he boxed as a heavyweight amateur, he actually enrolled in correspondence law course. And the reason why he went back to school is that he wanted to go back to his Hosa people and be able to serve effectively as an educated person in that kingdom. In 1943, he joined what is now African National Congress, because he felt that the ideas that ANC was fostering and pushing for were resonating with his. Remember, he felt that that South Africa leadership, especially apartheid policy, was really against was actually oppressive. It was not good. And because this is what NAC was pushing for, so he felt he can join. For him, he actually championed what we would call youth league, so that ANC can be more popular. It can attain what we call volatility. It can be more effective. It can spread tentacles, and the message of ANC would be more known more better, and that a lot of South Africans would be able to understand and embrace the ideas that were being advanced by ANC. Fate would have it that because he rubbed the authorities the long way, especially because he took a militant stand. It's very interesting that Nelson Mandela, especially in 1950s, he actually took on what would call a militant stand, and we cannot blame him, because if you go through Africa, you understand that every African who was against the colonial masters of the day, actually most of them employed militant strategy, and for many it worked. If you look at Koitalel Arap Samoei, the Nandi resistance, if you go to Majimaji rebellion, where Kijaketile Ngware told the people that if you take this magic water, the bullets of the colonizers will not be able to kill you. If you look at the Mau Mau in 1952, they all offered military. They all went military way, as opposed to Nabongo in Uganda. I mean the Nabongo of Mumias and the Uganda people who actually chose collaboration. For ANC and Mandela in particular, they chose militant way, the guerrilla warfare. And this, of course, did not go well with him, so he ended up spending a whole 27 years in prison because he was against, as we have said, racial apartheid. It was a policy that actually majored and thrived on separateness. There were separate streets, separate hotels, separate hospitals. They would not mix with the colonial masters. A policy of segregation. And when you look at him, and finally after coming out of prison, we know he was voted the first president under without apartheid policy, and he was handed power by Frederick de Klerk, the president by then. I would say Frederick de Klerk was a little bit friendly. His policies and his views on including Africans into power were a little bit moderate, although we can say there was also the international pressure that was building on South Africa to be able to lower and soften their stand on apartheid. So maybe we can ask ourselves, what are some of those traits that when we look at Nelson Mandela would actually make him to become makes him to fit the bill of an example of Joseph generational leaders. And the first one that comes to mind is that he was what we'd call a bridge builder. A bridge builder. And I know some of you will ask me, John, in 1950s, Nelson Mandela was a militant. He was engaging in guerrilla warfare. He would transverse the continent, sourcing for ammunition, sourcing for weapons. Even when he was caught and imprisoned because he was trying to do what we call overturning. He believed in violence. But as he matured and when he went into prison, his militant view, he dropped it. And he looked at a way in which he can be able to work with his enemies, with people that they would not see eye to eye. And he initiated relationship that cut across the lines of conflict. And he looked for ways to communicate and to build trust between the warring parties and groups. And then from the Bible, then would call him a peacemaker. And peacemakers, we know what they do is that they break down barriers between people. They try to break down a hostility. And we can ask a question: when do we need these peacemakers? When do we need bridge makers? We need them when we have broken down relationships. And of course, we know in South Africa, there were broken relationships, personal relationships between the colonial master and the South Africans. And when there are broken relationships, there is a lot of distrust, there is a lot of anger, there is a lot of fear that exists between enemies. And enemies don't, the people there don't look at each other with trust. They don't love one another. They don't have faith for one another. So that is an ideal scenario where we need a bridge builder. And also, number two, we need bridge builders in areas where there is a lot of misunderstanding. Hostility brings what we would call misunderstanding. People lead from different script, and bridge builders, one of the things that they will do is that they will try to work around and ensure that people are able to understand, they're able to hear each other. They want to remove what we call assumptions, they want to remove prejudices, they want to remove things that would make a communication to be broken. Okay. Again, another scenario where we need bridge builders, that bridge builders are really required, and it also worked within the environment of Nelson Mandela time, is when there is presence of fear. South Africans were living at a time when they were feeling threatened, and they did not. The colonial masters also feared and that's why they were very quick to pick Nelson Mandela and to throw him into prison. And a bridge builder, one of the things that he does is that he deliberately plants seeds of love and not of hatred. And they teach the warring parties, the opposing parties, effective strategies of dealing with fear so that they get close to each other. Remember, Joseph in the Bible, in the Old Testament, one of the things that he did when he was reconciling himself with brothers is that he says, come close to me. One of the quickest ways and effective ways of destroying fear is drawing close to people. That means initiating meetings of eating together, working together, praying together. And so this is what Nelson Mandela did. A bridge builder also thrives well in situations where there's anger. Remember, anger is a double-edged sword. There is a moment when anger works well, and there are moments when anger is destructive. So anger can be constructive and destructive. And by the way, you can watch our YouTube channel, and there's a lesson that we've done, a whole lesson that we've done on anger management. Parties, when they are engaged in anger, they work out to hurt one another, to harm one another. But a bridge builder comes in and help each other to express anger in a non-violent manner that actually leads to reconciliation. And this is what actually Nelson did in his capacity. He wanted people to express their anger, not necessarily to hurt other people, but so that reconciliation and forgiveness can be done. And you remember, he started what we call Truth and Reconciliation Committee, headed by then the late Desmond Tutu, who actually did a very good work. The goal of this commission was not to point out and to heap blame on the colonial masters, but it was to give an opportunity to the South Africans to speak out of the atrocities, the pains, the agonies that they went through. And then once they express that, they go through catharsis, and then the people who did whatever it is, they would ask for forgiveness so that the country would move together. The fifth scenario where bridge builders are ideal and needed is when there is presence of stereotypes and prejudices. Of course, parties that are fighting each other, warring parties, they have what we would call preconceived, fixed, or over simplified image or ideas of their opponents. At other times, those preconceived ideas or image are not based on reasons or any actual experiences. They are just passed down. They are not justified. They are not factual. And one of the effective ways that a bridge builder does is to demystify those prejudices, those stereotypes, because the presence of stereotypes and prejudices in any scenario actually shuts down communication, and they keep both parties away from each other. And so a bridge builder comes in, and this is what Nelson Mandela did. One of the ways in which he did is that he organized rugby. Rugby was a sport that was exclusively for the whites, for the colonial masters, and he formed a national team. And when the national team actually came, it was both the colonial masters and also the South Africans, and it was the first time. And previously, this team has been banned. It has been disbanded. It has been not been allowed to play because of the apartheid. And when the Africans, the South Africans and the whites, I mean the colonial masters, of course, under independent South Africa, when they met, they were able to defeat the New Zealand. And that kind of sport was able to break down, it was able to destroy the stereotypes and the prejudices that actually existed. And this then makes and cuts and brand Nelson Mandela as what we would call master of forgiveness. Okay? And because we see him, much as he spent more than almost a third of his life behind prison, he actually worked around to ensure that the transition of power was done under the altar of reconciliation. It is actually said that during his inauguration, he actually traveled a lot of miles to have tea with the widow of the prime minister in power that time. And this prime minister is the very same one who actually ordered and ensured that he went into prison. And this is said to have been inspired by Mahatma Gandhi, as well as the American civil rights activist Martin Luther King, who actually believed in non-violence. And when Nelson was being released from prison in 1990, he was released to a world that was bitterly divided, very bitter, and people were oppressed by apartheid. But as we said, he was very creative, he was very bold, and he used rugby to unite the country. That was in 1995. And during that time, he is said to have said one team, one country. And that win actually marked the end of apartheid in South Africa. Okay, and no wonder Bishop Desmond Tutu, given the his efforts to bring peace, to bring reconciliation, and even the mere fact that he was willing to share government of national unity together with Frederick de Klerk, shows that he was a bridge builder, not a bridge destroyer. And it is very important lesson for the political class of the day, that even when you run up and down, campaigning, that you desist and run away from what we would call toxic and divisive politics. The politics of we versus them does not come in, because we are branding ourselves as bridge builders. And I think again it is also very important that we desist again from laughing and mocking the political losers. We have a culture all over Africa where we mock and actually jeer and laugh at the political losers. And one of the things that should come to our lives, yes, politics might be a game, but the supporters do not understand the dynamics. Yes, as political contestants, we may jeer at each other, mock each other, and tear each other in public. Yet behind the scenes, we'll meet at Java and love one another and share coffee. Our supporters, quote unquote, do not understand that. And so, as bridge builders, we should desist from making our opponents look bad. We should stop the narrative of us versus them. We are superior, they are nothing, they have lost. That kind of thing does not have space for bridge builders. Again, and that is a lesson that we pick from Nelson Mandela. The next lesson that we pick from Nelson Mandela is that change begins from inside out. Change begins from inside out. Nelson was not only a bridge builder, but he was somebody who allowed change to come from inside. Everywhere you see Nelson Mandela photos, and I'm going to show you some of his photos here, you always see him. You can look at that one, he is smiling. If you look at that one, he is smiling. If I just show you those two, you can see Nelson Mandela is actually smiling. You can look at that one, he is smiling. Look at that one, he is smiling. He was one guy who always traded what would call a smile, an infectious smile. And he didn't have good reason to smile because almost that of his life was spent behind bars. Some historian, that is Kevin and Jackie Freiberg, are they of the opinion that Mandela wanted a life of meaning and significance. He wanted to live a life that is full of happiness and bring freedom to his people. And for us to be able to live a significant life, a life of adding contribution and making the world become a better, then it is very important for us to ask ourselves some key question. And question number one would be, how do we know that we have really lived? And what will be remembered with? And Nelson Mandela wanted to be remembered in bringing to an end apartheid, bringing equality, creating a scenario where every South African is free, is not hindered, is not blocked from becoming that which God wanted it to be. And Nelson, in his time, whether in prison or whether as a president, as a one-term president, he developed what would call generative leadership, and this is the kind of generative leadership. Generative leadership is a kind of leadership that is concerned about care and growth of future generations. In other words, he laid a foundation. He created an environment that would help future South Africans who were living and who would be born later, way after his death, would find South Africa free, would find the streets that are clean, would not be hated and rejected and oppressed, all in the name of being a South African. And this is a leadership that actually helps to help others to live in dignity and to help them to be moral and to feel motivated and to feel a sense of belonging, feel being loved. On July 18th, 2007, on his 89th birthday, it is said that Nelson Mandela did something that was very key, very strange, unexpected, because he actually convened a group of what would call those independent global leaders, the likes of the late UN Chief Kofi Annan, the former US President Jim Carter, and the likes. And he called them the elders. And he spoke to them. He spoke truth and asked them to have courage, and he asked them where there is fear to foster agreement, where there is conflict to inspire peace, where there is hope, despair to inspire hope. And the elders actually 10 years till, I mean, even today the elders are still responding to this call, which shows that Nelson wanted to leave a world better. And remember, in 2007 here, he was already out. He had actually given power to Thabo Mbeki, who took over after him. The third lesson that we pick from Nelson Mandela is an example of who would call an example of Joseph generation leader is that be optimistic. There is an excellent article done by Victor Olwole called The 7 Unforgettable Leadership from South Africa iconic leader Nelson Mandela. And he said that Nelson faced a lot of odds. These odds that he faced, especially in prison, actually almost took away his vision, okay, of a free nation. But the beautiful thing is that he never wavered. He still kept at the vision. He actually said in his own words that I am fundamentally an optimist. Part of being optimistic is keeping one head pointed toward the sun, one's feet moving forward. There were many dark moments when my faith in humanity was sorely tested, but I would not and could not give myself up to despair. That way lays defeat and death. And that shows he was basically somebody who stuck, who was quite passionate, who never wavered. He kept on walking, and no matter the odds, no matter the discouragement, no matter the challenges that he went, he believed in his vision of a free country, of a South Africa without apartheid, of a South Africa where South Africa would be encouraged and would be participating in democracy making. And he never wavered, and his vision was clear, it was consistent, he kept on. Until finally in 1990 he was released from prison, and almost immediately he went and became the president and laid the foundation in which future South Africans, president and political leaders are able to build on. Now the fourth leadership trait that cuts and shows that Nelson Mandela was an example of Joseph generation leader is that he had courage in the face of adversity. And we've said it and we'll keep on saying that he faced immense opposition in his fight for equality. His convictions did not resonate with the colonial master of his day. But while in prison, despite the conditions being harsh, we took that as a platform to build relationships with his adversary. Very strange that when he dropped the military view, and given that he was not effective into militant, that he was able to go out there and start forming relationships with his adversary to try and explain to them, to make the opposition to understand from him. And I think it's a very important strategy that the opposition can do, instead of going out there and banning and making roads impassable and making the country ungovernable. I believe where the opposition can initiate this kind of conversation, build relationships with the adversary, and develop strategies so that the government in power can be able to understand the grievances, the challenges, of the opposition, and so work out strategies so that there is amicable solutions and there is no bloodshed. Lesson number 5 is commitment to do that which is right. Always. Once he assumed power, the South Africans came to him in large numbers and they spoke clearly and told him, you need to revenge. You need to give retribution against the white rulers who promoted apartheid. Actually, they need to be killed. They need to be taken to court. There needs to be a sense of retribution. We need to revenge. And it is actually said immediately when he came out from prison, he was asked, what will you do? And his words were firm. He said, I have chosen to forgive. And a lot of CEOs and a lot of political players, once they assume power, we use that power instead of serving, instead of building, instead of developing, instead of becoming a blessing. We use that power. And it doesn't matter whether it is the seen them going out there and punishing, using that power, God-given power, that mandate that they have been given to punish those that are there. And I think this is a very big lesson that we can learn, not to use power to revenge, but to use power to build, to bless, to make the world a little bit better than it is. Then leadership, lesson number 6 in leadership, character is more important than strategy. And this is a lesson that actually Nelson Mandela teaches us. And the mere fact that he was unwilling to revenge, the mere fact that he was unwilling to spread hostility, shows that he was a man of character. He was a man of character. And then maybe finally we can say that Nelson Mandela teaches us that the best leaders know when to stop. Nelson Mandela was actually elected and he served only a 5-year term. That is from 1994 and 1999. And when time came, he actually refused deliberately to run another term. The constitution of his day gave him power to run for 2 terms, but then he decided that he's not going to run for another term. He is going to pass on baton to a younger, a more visionary, a more energetic leader. Remember, by the time Nelson was taking on power, he was old, and so he felt he needs to hand over power to a younger president, and the world actually saluted him. And they were shocked, they were baffled, even he having come in from Africa. He retired from active politics and actually took over philanthropic activities. And the decision not to run for the second term actually came 3 years before election, and that was on July 1996. In a television broadcast, he said, I'm not going to run for reaction in 1999, and he believed that 1 term was enough for him to lay the foundation for other leaders to learn on. In 2017, this continent is strange, and because in 2017 Angolan President Jose Eduardo dos Santos stepped down after 38 years in office. Zimbabwe, his colleague in Zimbabwe, that is the late President Robert Mugabe, was actually forced out of office by a military coup after 37 years. Look at Omar Bashir. He was ousted after almost 30 years in power. In Africa again, Chad, Idris Deby, he had ruled Chad for 30 years, and he died following a battlefield where they crashed with rebels. We have 6 African heads of state that have been in power for more than 10 years. Look at Togo and Gabon, countries that have been led by family dynasties which have ruled for more than 30 years. Look at President Emerson Mnangagwa for Zimbabwe, who appointed his son, his nephew, his wife, all to the cabinet this year. Look at that. And this is actually an indication of a leader who is not in hurry to hand in over power, And one of the characteristics of this president, we call them president for life, is that they lead with iron fist, And one author, Samson Behani, described them that these are president for life. And that is the nickname that we give to Africans, autocratic president who always invent new justification or rules so that they continue be in power. Okay, but look at Nelson Mandela. 1 term, and then he was gone. He actually was he got off from power, and no wonder in November 2009. The United Nations declared July 18 as Nelson Mandela International Day, and the first day was observed in July 2010. And according to the UN, Nelson Mandela is not a public holiday, but a day to honor the legacy of Nelson Mandela. And so that means that Nelson Mandela was a leader who cut the image of what would call Joseph generation leader in Africa. This is Marketplace Media, an online platform that engages, equips, and encourages believers to say in Wezekana. As a way of quitting the stage, let us read some of the quotes. The brave man is not he who does not feel afraid, but he who conquers that fear. What counts in life is not mere fact that we have lived, it's the difference we've made to the lives of others that will determine the significance of the life that we lead. Another powerful one here is education is the most powerful weapon which you can use to